beginning to rain.
Hello, my name's Dennis Reschke. You've tuned into the program Fresh Bread, program dedicated to discussing the things of the kingdom of God. This is the seventh segment of a multi-part series on God and government. We left off last time talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict and relationship in the Middle East right now. One of the questions comes up, does God still give special favor and protection to the nation of Israel? There are two views on this question in evangelical circles. One is called dispensationalism. This is the view that God promised the land to Israel and its descendants. This is an eternal promise that has been partially fulfilled and will be completely fulfilled in the future. The other viewpoint is a non-dispensational perspective, which holds that the Jewish people 2,000 years ago rejected Jesus as the Messiah and therefore forfeited their right to the blessing of God. Furthermore, many of the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament were seen by the New Testament authors to be fulfilled in the church already. While dispensationalists would argue that these promises of the land will be literally fulfilled in the future time of great tribulation after Christ's return to remove the church from the earth, i.e. the rapture, non-dispensationalists do not think there will be such a time of tribulation when the church is removed from the earth. Both these views share some common ground. First, both sides should clearly affirm that the Jewish people do not have a separate path to salvation apart from trusting in Jesus as their Messiah. There is no special second path of salvation for people just because they come from a Jewish heritage. Individual Jews can always accept Jesus as their Savior, so this discussion of Jews accepting the Messiah concerns the nation of Israel and Jews as a people, as a whole. Individual Jews accepting Christ are called Messianic Jews. These are Jewish Christian converts. Paul speaks again of the Jewish people's rejection of Christ as temporary, for he says, quote, "A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved," unquote. That's Romans 11:25 and 26. Paul goes on to say, quote, "As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake," speaking of Christians, "but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers." That's verse 28, same chapter. So he still counts them beloved, quote, "for the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable," it says in the 29th verse of that same chapter. All of this shows that Paul still believes that God views the Jewish people who have rejected Christ as a special ethnic group out of all the people of the earth, a group that God still considers to be, quote, "beloved for the sake of their forefathers," unquote. And because of this, at some future time, all Israel will be saved. That's verse 26. So the bottom line is God still has a kind of special favor and care for the people of Israel. So back to government, should the U.S. give special protection and favor to Israel? We should never say about any nation that we all will always support whatever it does, whether or not we agree with it. Our policy should never be Israel is always all right, any more than it would be England is always right, or Canada is always right, or the United States is always right. We can still be close allies without agreeing on every jot and tittle of diplomacy and statecraft. Having said all that, I think we should still treat Israel as a very special and close ally. We should defend its rights to exist and to defend itself. We should seek ways in which we can help her grow and prosper as a nation through free trade, cultural exchanges, educational and technological exchanges, access to military technology, promotion of tourism, and so forth. Additionally, Israel should deserve special favor from the United States because it is our most reliable ally out of all the other Middle Eastern countries. It is one of the most advanced nations in the world in terms of scientific technological inventions, information processing, and financial management. When it finally decided to reject the socialistic economic system it had in place for several decades after its inception in 1948, it became one of the most successful entrepreneurial free market economies in that part of the world. Biblically, Christians should support Israel because of the positive moral force Judaism promotes, and because in the book of Romans, Scripture terms it as the tree, and we Christians the branches of that tree. Without the tree support, branches die. Christianity was birthed from the Jewish religion. Jesus and the 12 disciples were Jews. The Bible also declares that God rules over affairs of sovereign nations. By recognizing national sovereignty, we are tacitly agreeing with God that Israel is a legitimate nation. And finally, regarding the dispensational issue, it is good that we not let doctrinal differences interfere with the main thing, which is the Great Commission, witnessing to the Jews that Jesus is Messiah. All right, now let's turn our attention to immigration. The Old Testament contains many verses that command the people of Israel to treat the sojourner, also translated alien, fairly and with kindness and love. For example, Exodus 22:21 says, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt," unquote. The Hebrew word ger refers to legal immigrant. Other people who did not have this recognized standing were simply termed foreigners, using other Hebrew words, and they did not have the same benefits or privileges that sojourners did. Hoffmeyer, in his book The Immigration Crisis, concludes that the legal alien ought to have most of the rights of citizenship. Hoffmeyer also emphasizes that nations in the world of the Old Testament clearly placed a high priority on protecting their borders and having the right to decide who would enter their nation and who would not. He says, quote, "Nowhere in the Old Testament is there any sense that a nation had to accept immigrants, nor was being received as an alien a right," unquote. As was discussed earlier, government should seek the good of its citizens. Thus, immigration policies of a nation should be designed to bring benefits to that specific nation as a whole. This would imply the U.S. should control all immigration processes, giving priority to accepting people who will most likely make a positive contribution to U.S. society. They should have sufficient education and training to support themselves, demonstrating significant achievements in some area or another, and all those who otherwise give evidence that they will make a positive contribution. It should exclude those with a criminal record, have communicable diseases, or whose overall contribution to society is negative. Although the U.S. is a nation of immigrants, Native Americans notwithstanding, two factors make the present impasse regarding immigration different from the past. Illegal immigrants to the tune of 13 million is unprecedented. In the past, immigration proceeded through legal channels. The second issue is the tendency for immigrants not to assimilate into American society and remain autonomous as subcultures. Many retain their native language and do not learn English. This keeps them in the lowest unskilled class of workers who end up draining the lion's share of social welfare resources, such as Medicaid, food assistance, free school lunches, federal aid for schooling, and use of the federal prison and court systems. Some influential immigrant leaders actually promote the lack of assimilation into the United States. Allowing such viewpoints to prosper is completely contrary to the best interests of the United States as a whole. What is the solution to these two problems? The first is to secure the borders, especially with Mexico, where the majority of illegal immigration occurs. A secure fence would stop 99% of illegal immigrants from Mexico. Even those who enter with no intent of breaking any further laws, but only of finding employment, do this in a way that is unfair to thousands of others who decide to abide by the law and wait many years to be admitted as immigrants by legal means. Then these illegal immigrants become part of a growing underground economy and a permanent underclass that is really protected by the law because the legal system does not have a record that they even exist. It means they can be easily exploited because they won't seek legal help when wrong has been done against them. It also means American citizens have reason to fear them because police have no means of tracking them if any illegal activity has occurred. Their very presence and toleration genders disrespect for the rule of law. Illegal aliens are living in constant disobedience of Paul's command, quote, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities." That's Romans 13:1. Secondly, we should enact comprehensive reform of the present immigration system. The first change should occur regarding so-called chain migration or family reunification. Under pressure from President Johnson, Congress passed the Hart-Celler Act in 1965, which allowed citizens of the U.S. to sponsor spouses and extended family members into the U.S. without any qualification. Immigration numbers increased from 4.2 million in the 1970s to about 9.7 million in the 90s. In 1986, President Reagan, under the Reform and Control Act, granted a one-time amnesty to about 3 million illegal immigrants who had entered the U.S. before January of 1982. Although designed as a one-time event, it actually set up a precedent for more and more such exceptions in the future. It set up a precedent for future illegal immigrants' hope that one day it would happen again. The large influx of Spanish-speaking immigrants has placed a strain on the school system and the medical community. If a government screens its immigrants, as mentioned earlier, immigrants could be a great boon to society. In the past, immigrants tended to be the better half of their homeland society. The lower half tended not to immigrate. Some of our best and brightest originally came from other countries. Third, there is a need for reform in educational circles to include patriotism and national pride. By this, children going up in American schools can be taught the moral standards and ideals that have historically been true of the nation. We should continue to require that any new citizen must renounce allegiance to any other nation and swear allegiance to the United States. In addition, we should place much greater emphasis on the need to learn English well. Children who grow up without learning English are seriously disadvantaged in almost any career field they choose. Having a central language adds to the sense of national pride and belonging. Having multiple languages tends to fragment society and creates unnecessary ethnic barriers. After the September 11th attacks, severe restrictions were placed on individuals seeking visas. These included highly trained scientists, inventors, medical professionals, university researchers, and others with similar qualifications. Once these people pass security scrutiny, they should be allowed entrance in the United States. Fourth, tighter regulations should be enforced on employers hiring illegal immigrants. There are two kinds of harm that can result from this. One is that the employers can do anything illegal to this employee with impunity, and this employee has no recourse to appeal his cause to any agencies involved in such matters. Secondly, it gives incentive for other illegal aliens to enter the U.S. to find jobs themselves, thus compounding the problem. In Arizona, an E-Verify program requires employers to electronically verify the legal status of all their employees with Homeland Security. This system is currently only voluntary in other states. Regarding the issue of what to do with illegal immigrants that are already here, I think this is such an emotional topic for us all that until the border situation is fixed, discussion of this subject should be deferred. When emotions have cooled a bit, this discussion should resume. Those who have known criminal records should be deported back to Mexico. Some sort of official temporary status should be given to those who are here in order that law enforcement has something to work with as to their identification. Such a registration system should be required before they receive any kind of medical treatment as incentive. This temporary registration should have to be coupled with a system by which they would have to seek full U.S. citizenship or else permanent residency, i.e. a green card status, or have their permission to stay in the country revoked after a certain number of years. One objection that is raised concerning immigrants is that they take jobs away from Americans. This perspective is based on a misunderstanding of economics. The number of jobs in a society is never fixed, but is always changing. When talented new people come into a society, they may take some jobs, but they also create other jobs because they produce goods and services that make the entire society wealthier, and their work also produces some demand from many products. The benefits that come from production of productive immigrants far outweighs the disadvantages. How should the church treat immigrants? For immigrants who are here illegally, churches should be a wonderful home away from home, a welcoming committee to a new life. The church should try to help them adapt and cope with many new ways and laws that they are required to master. Churches must remind employers to treat legal immigrants justly and fairly, never taking advantage of them. As far as those who are illegally here, the church should be kindly and honestly confront them that they are doing what they're doing is illegal. Illegal immigrants are obligated before God to obey the laws of the land. If I were immigrating to another country, I would do so legally and learn their ways and language. If I was not willing to do this, then I shouldn't go. If there is economic incentive for Mexican immigration, our source and God is able to meet all our needs, material and otherwise. It may be to instruct such people of the promises of God that provide this to the believer. It may happen that the illegal immigrant will have to leave the country and apply for entry into the United States on the same basis as everyone else, through proper legal channels. We must encourage them to trust God that obedience to Him in the long run will be the path of greatest blessing in their lives. What about a guest worker program? It does not seem to me that a temporary guest worker program would be a wise idea. The idea is for seasonal agricultural workers to come in for harvest and then return to Mexico at the end of the season. In practice, what happens is that many workers stay illegally and slip into the underground. In this way, the guest worker program becomes a pipeline for illegal immigration. This program was tried in Europe and failed. Moving on now to the next specific topic of freedom of speech. Several arguments from earlier discussions provide a biblical basis for government to protect the freedom of speech in a nation. The tendency to sin is in all of us. Government is run by people. There is always a tendency of those in power to abuse it. Power tends to corrupt people. Freedom of speech allows people to speak out and criticize the government when they think it is doing something wrong. Government should be chosen by the people themselves, which in practice means some kind of democracy. The biblical support this is implied in is in Genesis 1:27, Exodus 4:29 through 31, 2 Samuel 2 verse 4, and Romans 13:4. Freedom of speech in society is necessary to protect the idea of democracy itself. Without freedom of speech and freedom of press, which goes hand in hand, rulers can suppress criticism and prohibit candidates that oppose their views. Without these freedoms, true democracy would cease to exist. Another reason for freedom of speech is to protect human liberty. The Bible views liberty of human activity as essential. You can see Exodus 20, verse 2, Leviticus 25, verse 10, Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, and Isaiah 61, 1 for citations of this sentiment. One significant part of human liberty is the freedom to express one's ideas and to persuade others to their views. Along with this idea is the notion of freedom of religion. Part of any religion involves the communication by words or freedom to speak. Religious speech should always be protected. Christians should be able to speak the gospel message freely in public, and so obey Matthew 28, 19 and 20, without fear of censorship. By advocating freedom of speech, this in turn ensures freedom of choice. If our government allows only one view to be expressed publicly, then people have no real choice left them. The Bible places high value on respecting human freedom of choice. See Deuteronomy 30, verse 19, Joshua 24, verse 15, Matthew 11, 28, and Revelation 22, 17. People need to have access to all ideas in order to truly have a freedom of choice. The First Amendment of the Constitution ensures freedom of speech, of religion, the press, to assemble peaceably, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Freedom, however, has its limits. It is pretty much accepted among philosophers, for example, that yelling fire in a crowded public place when there is no fire is a violation of freedom of speech and is culpable by law. Another violation of freedom of speech is slander, something also covered by the law. Another violation of freedom of speech is obscenity and pornography. What about the issue of campaign contributions? Moving on. Should there be a limit on these? The stated goals of restricting financial contributions in the political arena are 1. Removing the corrupting influence of money from politics, and 2. Giving every citizen an equal voice in political discussions. On the surface, this sounds fair enough. However, a closer look will reveal it actually advantages the liberal side of politics. In fact, the Federal Election Campaign Acts of 1971 and its subsequent amendments 3 years later were written and supported by Democrats who are in recent times associated with liberal politics. The real effect of these laws is not to level the playing field, quote, and give every person an equal voice. Rather, it is simply to remove much of the influence of private citizens who want to use their own contributions to support candidates they believe in. Where then lies real influence outside of the political machine that has traditionally been financed by the private sector? 1, the incumbent has a huge advantage over the competition because of the name recognition and known track record, but this can be said of both liberals and conservatives. 2, the press. The average citizen gets their information about candidates from what the press writes about them and TV broadcasts. The press, for many years now, is decidedly liberal in its views. A survey by the Pew Research Center in 2004 showed 5 times as many liberals as conservative amongst journalists. Fully 91% of those who work at national news organizations say it is not necessary to believe in God to be moral. Morality outside of a transcendent God is nonsense. There are no morals without God. Any talk of such is sophistry and philosophical cant. 1 Corinthians 2, 5 and 6 says, "Our faith stands on the wisdom of God, not of men, for the wisdom of men comes to nothing." Christianity stands or falls on the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is supernatural and not mere morality. All religions have something to say about morality, but only Christianity has anything transcendent to stand on. Labor unions are another source of liberal influence that is not subject to campaign influential reform laws. They provide large amounts of funding and volunteer labor for more liberal candidates. Hollywood movies and stars are another source of significant influence in the political process. Like labor unions, this industry has its constituents, and its constituents are mostly liberal and have significant influence toward the election of liberal candidates. Universities in America started out as Christian and conservative, but have devolved into liberal propaganda machines. Most professors in American universities are liberal and have significant power of influence over those they teach. Finally, the super wealthy candidate can finance his or her campaign without restriction of spending from their own wealth. This is true for both liberal and conservative candidates, of course. Therefore, these laws have not kept the money out of politics. The true restriction then falls on the average citizen who wants to run for office. He can't compete with a wealthy candidate and can receive only paltry sums from wealthy contributors who support his views. This advantages the wealthy candidate. This is an indirect way of restricting freedom of speech. There is a loophole to these laws in the form of so-called 527 organizations. Both liberals and conservatives can contribute to these groups. Although they are not allowed to advocate for any particular candidate, unlimited funds may be given to them to support liberal or conservative views in general. No direct input is allowed by individual candidates to these organizations. Thus, presently, there are in effect no real financial restrictions on political campaigning, it seems to me. As a Christian citizen under a just government, any new laws coming up that advocate funding restrictions should consider these issues here discussed and see if any one side of the political aisle is advantaged by these proposed laws. Moving on to hate speech codes and other restrictions to freedom of speech on college campuses. In the past 20 years, many colleges and universities in the United States have enacted policies that restrict freedom of speech in various ways. 97% of these new policies characterize hate speech as any communication that causes, quote, offense to anyone. Because of such hate speech, quote, codes, sometimes students have been penalized for expressing belief in the gospel of Jesus Christ or attempting to share their faith or moral values with others. Christian legal organizations, such as Alliance Defense Fund, have had remarkable success in challenging these policies. Hate speech codes are wrong, both because they violate a biblical value of freedom of speech and because they violate the First Amendment right of freedom of speech. If the principle of freedom of speech does not protect speech that other people find offensive or objectionable, then it is not really freedom of speech at all. It's not true that necessarily expressing moral opposition to some action will inevitably lead to violence against others. Arguing that abortion is morally wrong, for example, does not necessarily or even probably lead people to take violent action against those who carry out abortion. Nor does arguing that homosexual conduct is morally wrong lead necessarily or even probably to others taking violent action against homosexuals. It is precisely the freedom discussion of differences regarding moral values and principles that is necessary to allow a democracy to work these questions out fairly and reasonably in the political process. What about talk radio? In 1949, the Federal Communication Commission, the FCC, introduced a policy called Fairness Doctrine, which required that radio stations broadcasting some discussion of controversial issues do so in a way that is honest, equitable, and balanced. In practice, this meant that radio stations would often present speakers giving differing views of some political issue or other, a controversial public matter, but the policy was based on the idea that there were a limited number of broadcast stations available. This now is no longer the case. So in 1987, the FCC abolished the fairness doctrine. This was predicated on the fact that the doctrine restricted freedom of speech because it had forced the station to represent views it did not hold to be true. The actual result of abolition of the fairness doctrine has been interesting. The proliferation of conservative talk radio. Has this been a good development? I think so, speaking as a conservative. I also think it's good because the media of television is largely dominated by liberal views. Liberals do not like conservative talk radio. There have been some discussion of reinstituting the fairness doctrine to force conservative radio programs and stations to include liberal viewpoints in their discussions. If legislation should ever be proposed in the future to introduce this doctrine or some facsimile thereof, I would urge Christians to vote no on it for the reasons stated. Moving on to freedom of religion in government. Although I have touched on it in previous discussions, I'd like to delve into the subject a little further. Jesus said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God." That's Matthew 22:21. In this statement, Jesus established the principle of a distinct realm of things that belong to God that should not be regulated or constrained by the government or Caesar. Peter and John, when faced with stricture from the Sanhedrin whether to obey government censor, replied, quote, "We cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard." That's Acts 4:20. "We must obey God rather than men." That's Acts 5:29. They chose civil disobedience when government overstepped its bounds. In recent times, the mantra separation of church and state has bludgeoned Christians into a corner. The First Amendment was not understood by anyone in 1787 to prohibit government officials from freely expressing their own religious beliefs in public, and particularly at government functions, nor was it understood that way by the entire legal system of the United States for about the next 2 centuries. For example, for many years, the U.S. Congress allowed Christian worship services to be conducted on Sundays in the Capitol itself. According to the Library of Congress, quote, throughout his administration, Thomas Jefferson, from whom the phrase came to us, permitted church services in executive branch buildings. The gospel also preached in the Supreme Court chambers. Numerous presidential proclamations have made reference to God. George Washington, in his proclamation calling for a national day of thanksgiving, made reference to Almighty God. In 1863, the U.S. Senate requested President Abraham Lincoln to, quote, designate and set apart a day for national prayer and humiliation. Lincoln complied. In 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt went on national radio and offered prayer for soldiers in the name of Almighty God. Therefore, recent Supreme Court decisions that have had the effect of excluding religious expression from the public square cannot be justified. The phrase separation of church and state cannot be found in the Constitution or in any national laws passed by Congress. It originated in a personal letter of then-President Jefferson regarding the free practice of religion of choice in the state of concerned citizen. This citizen was concerned that he had to follow a religion deemed by his state as the state religion. Jefferson assured him that no state nor national government could tell him what religion to follow, if any. There was a separation between religion and the state, in other words. Our forefathers had just come from England, where a government dictated what religion one must follow. This new government in America they formed wanted to avoid doing that same thing. The sentiment never was construed to mean that the religion of a man was not to be expressed in public or in government affairs. If there is a legal separation of church and state, why do we employ chaplains in the military? No soldier is compelled to attend any service the chaplain might hold, nor is he or she compelled to seek prayer or guidance from him. Why do most, if not all, public universities in this country have a religious studies department? Students are not compelled to take any class from this department, but it seems to me the public is indirectly financing religion by the very existence of these departments. Freedom of religion also provides liberty not to attend or participate in a public religious activity. Christian nativity scenes set up in public places do not compel anyone to become a Christian, any more than an advertisement for cigarettes compels anyone to smoke cigarettes. The only present catch to public Christian displays during Christmas is that they must include a sufficient number of secular objects in close proximity, such as a creche, so as not to convey a message or endorsing a particular religious view. Prayer in public schools was outlawed in 1962 by the Supreme Court. Since then, many negative effects have ensued on our young people. Any legislation to reverse this decision should be supported by Christian citizenry. Government should not prohibit this. Teachers presently cannot express their views to their class unless they are invited by a student to do so. The idea here is that if prohibited to do so, the teacher's free speech rights are violated. Today, when the courts operate by a misguided principle that nobody should be offended by any religious expression in public, then freedom of religion and freedom of speech are severely curtailed in a wrongful way. There is no constitutional or moral right not to feel offended. On January 29, 2001, shortly after he became president, George W. Bush established the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, OFBCI. This office was created to improve the ability of so-called faith-based organizations to obtain federal funding for the social services such as job training, drug rehabilitation, alcohol rehabilitation, prison ministries, and free housing and food for the poor and homeless. There was much controversy over this action. In my opinion, much good can come from government financial assistance to these organizations. The activities of these groups advance the common good in many ways and actually save tax dollars. There are significant benefits to the people, and these organizations tend to have a higher success rate than their secular equivalents. Of course, government aid should be open to any religious and non-religious group if they feel a need and are efficient at it. If in the course of their activities should they invite people to be born again and make Jesus Christ the Lord of their life, does this implicate government endorsement of a particular religion? No. The person is free to say no to the invitation. For government to nix this would be a wrongful prohibition of the free exercise of religion. The choice of individual to participate in these programs is voluntary, as is the choice to accept or reject what is said by them. What about the tax-exempt status of churches? In 1954, the U.S. Congress amended, without debate or analysis, Internal Revenue Code number 501c3 to restrict the speech of nonprofit tax-exempt entities, including churches, requiring that they refrain from any advocacy or opposition to any specific political candidates by name. This legislation was sponsored by then-Senator Lyndon Johnson. Before this amendment was passed, there were no restrictions on what churches could or couldn't do with regard to speech about government and voting, except for a 1934 law preventing nonprofits from using a substantial part of their resources to lobby for legislation. As a result of this 1954 amendment, the IRS has steadfastly maintained that any speech by churches about candidates for government can result in the loss of their tax-exempt status. This turns out to be a hollow threat because it has never revoked a church of their tax-exempt status despite recent challenges in various pulpits in the U.S. In keeping with the freedom of choice, speech, and religion, it would be wise for the pulpit to leave the choice of what candidate to vote for in the hands of the people and not to coerce them to vote one way or other. I fully endorse and encourage ministers in the pulpit to preach the ways of God that would guide someone to vote the consciousness of God, however. In this next special topic section, I'd like to address issues that I believe wrongfully give government powers to special interest groups. I believe the United States should abolish several laws and policies that give benefits to these groups. On the whole, they cost the nation much more than any benefits they may bring. The first group involves excessive government bureaucracies in business. Agencies such as Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, CPSC, and many other agencies. Because these agencies are policy-driven, they no longer have any flexibility to make judgments based on the needs of and specific circumstances in an individual situation, but must apply the regulation in a blind and often hurtful manner. Thus, we have a system of governing by excruciating detail, rather than allowing people to have freedom and exercise common sense. People and businesses end up paying hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for violating rules they didn't know existed, or for doing things that were causing no harm. What is lost is human freedom. Government bureaucrats who regulated people's lives have obtained far too much power, and the nation as a whole is poorer as a result. Earmarks. Earmarks are a political mechanism by which significant funding can be added to an unrelated bill for support of special interest groups. They can be inserted anonymously so that members of Congress don't have to identify which ones they have put into bills. There is no transparency or accountability in this system. Members of Congress can secure hundreds of millions of dollars of funding without subjecting it to debate. Earmarks are hard to identify and invite backroom deals and unethical or even corrupt behavior. Generally, the more powerful members of Congress get more earmarks. Earmarks can be inserted into spending bills during the closed committee meeting with no public scrutiny. Earmarks are offered to members of Congress to entice them to vote for a bill they would otherwise not vote for. Earmarks account for up to 2% of the federal budget. In 2009, there were 10,190 earmarks, totaling $19.6 billion. Another special interest group involves affirmative action. The government policy gives preferential treatment to minority groups in education, employment, and in awarding government contracts to businesses. At first blush, this policy might seem good to help disadvantaged minorities and women in a male-dominated society. But there are many disadvantages also. There is an inherent reverse discrimination against those groups that are of the majority, i.e. white males. Because standards are lowered for these minorities, hirees are less qualified than their white male counterparts. If all human beings are created in the image of God and are equal status before Him, then employment selection should be entirely free of racial or gender discrimination. Another difficulty with this government policy is that it tends to cast a doubt on the qualifications of all members of the minority who are hired. Did they get the position because they genuinely qualified or because of their racial background? Also, the majority group will likely feel resentment and a sense of unfairness. Thus, affirmative action simply perpetuates racial division and divisiveness. In the venue of school admissions, allowing less qualified minority students into a program results in underqualified graduates who take spaces were otherwise given to qualified students and end up failing to get jobs or keeping them because they did not have the inherent skills. Another reason to abolish this policy is that it tends to quench the initiative of those who are generally qualified. Finally, it is unconstitutional. The 14th Amendment abolished racial discrimination. This means there cannot be any preferences given based on racial background. Affirmative action policies are inherently discriminatory because they deny to the group that is not favored the equal protection of the laws. Related to this matter is the Title IX programs passed by Congress in 1972. This federal law bars sex discrimination by schools that receive federal money. Schools must offer scholarships and athletic advantages equally to male and female. What if more men than women want to be in university sports programs? And what if more men than women decide to actively participate in university sports programs? Do their preferences matter? Not according to Title IX. The result is that universities have had to arbitrarily cancel popular programs for men, such as wrestling and gymnastics, simply to reduce the number of men until it is equal to the number of women. This is government-mandated social engineering, attempting to force people to behave in certain ways rather than allowing people's different preferences and tendencies to work themselves out in accordance with human liberty. Both men and women will give substantially more time and money to watching men's sports than women's sports. I do not think this difference is the result of any wrong discrimination or wrongful societal conditioning. It is another example of government discrimination against individual human preferences. Some programs allow women and men to compete with each other, for example, in wrestling and in football. There are serious problems with this idea. It challenges the male's feelings of masculine strength and his sense of physical ability to protect others. And if he wins, he has become guilty of physically overpowering a woman against her will, and doing so in a way that is never appropriate for a man to do against a woman under any other circumstances at all. It is a violation of a deep-seated and God-given instinct. It encourages men to have a wrong attitude about women, an attitude that opposes the biblical one of protection and love. Likewise, women are thus encouraged to be aggressive, hostile, and violent against males, something that will not bode well in the future relationship with men. This is again the result of a humanistic government-sponsored attempt to deny the distinctive sexuality of men and women and to deny the essential differences between men and women as given by God. I would encourage Christian coaches to resign under such circumstances and Christian parents to withdraw their children from participating in such programs. Moving on to farm subsidies. These are fees paid to farmers by the government to either guarantee a certain minimum sale price for his produce or not to grow certain crops in the name of environmental issues or economic issues. The result of this system is the production of produce that cannot be sold in the normal economic environment. If a farmer grows too much wheat to sell for a profit on the world market, for example, the government will buy it. In turn, they will sell it for a fraction of the competitive price, lowering the global price of wheat. This disadvantages the wheat farmers in other countries that cannot compete with such low prices. The U.S. taxpayer is also disadvantaged because he is essentially paying for this. The consumer also pays because the price of corn or rye or other grains that would normally be grown instead of wheat are now artificially inflated. So he pays more for these products than a normal supply and demand economically competitive system would produce. The farmers benefit because they don't have to worry about going broke if they grow the wrong crop or too much of it. The farm lobby has immense influence in the U.S. Senate. Those who support such a policy say that it is necessary to keep certain kinds of agriculture within the United States, and if the nation did not keep domestic prices high in this way, the prices would drop so low that many farmers would be driven out of business. If these subsidies were done away with, probably only the huge conglomerate farmers could survive the global competition with cheaper overseas produce. But as prosperity in these foreign countries increases, their prices will also increase, allowing smaller farmers in these countries to survive. Lack of competition also allows present inefficient farmers to survive. So this brings us to the issue of tariffs. A tariff is a tax or fee imposed on goods when they enter or leave a country. The most common are those imposed upon goods entering the U.S. from foreign countries. Different countries find that they can manufacture products more efficiently or with better qualities than other countries can, and they export them. The United States, for example, exports nuclear reactors and machinery, electronic machinery, and various forms of vehicles. Because consumers' wants for more and more higher quality things will never be satisfied, all countries will always have some things that they can manufacture advantageously and from which a profit can be made. Labor unions often put the greatest pressure on the U.S. government to impose tariffs on imports of foreign goods. For example, if China can make a car tire for $20 less than its American counterpart, they will compete with American tire manufacturers. Thus, a $20 tariff is slapped on imported tires. This is an advantage to the American tire manufacturers and their workers, but a disadvantage to American consumers, who now have to pay $20 more per tire than they would otherwise. The American economy as a whole has become a loser because of the higher prices of imported tires. The Chinese tire companies, of course, do not like these tariffs. Therefore, they will often pressure Chinese government to place a retaliatory tariff on some American goods. The U.S. government gets revenue from tariffs, but the American consumer is really paying for the bill. Tariffs are simply a form of tax on American consumers. Tariffs take away the freedom of American consumers to spend their money as they please. The overall result of tariffs is to drive up the prices of everything that consumers buy if it is imported from other countries. Tariffs also prop up higher prices on products made within a country. For these reasons, I believe government to be a force of good to its people should eventually eliminate tariffs altogether. Towards this end, a free trade agreement has been established under President Reagan and George H. Bush in 1987. The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was eventually signed into law by President Bill Clinton with strong Republican support. A most favored nation, quote, status results in the lowest tariffs toward a country's imports. Today, the World Trade Organization, WTO, promotes lower tariffs and freer trade. Policies that maintain high tariffs are called protectionist policies and tend to protect certain industries and groups within a nation from competition coming from other countries. Since Democrats gained majorities in Congress in 2006, the United States has adopted a much more protectionist policy regarding foreign trade. Moving on to lawsuits and tort reform. The present legal system in the U.S. allows for huge lawsuits against a company who allegedly harms an individual. Such suits can, in some instances, put a company out of business and make the individual suing rich. One example is when a consumer sued McDonald's because the cup of coffee that she bought was too hot and burned her. She was awarded $2.86 million. A judge later reduced this amount to $480,000. This sue for anything justice erodes American freedom. Perhaps the worst casualty is volunteerism. Companies and institutions cannot afford to be sued by mistakes made by volunteers, so they must hire people to do the same work. This increases consumer prices. People no longer can do what they feel is right or wrong for fear of being sued. For this reason, many are calling for tort law reforms. Tort refers to this process of suit by an individual against a company or business when harm is done, but no law is actually broken. This is in contrast to criminal law, whereby a law has been broken. A 2008 estimate of total tort claims in the U.S. comes to $260 billion in a year. Small businesses absorbs $98 billion of that amount a year, money that could otherwise be used to hire additional workers, expand productivity, and improve employment benefits. Companies not wishing to go to court and pay additional fees about the tort claim will often settle out of court, even when they know they're not at fault. In the area of medicine, physicians can pay as much as $250,000 a year on malpractice insurance. This results in higher medical costs for the consumer. To avoid possible suit, a doctor will order many more tests than he or she normally would to cover them against malpractice. In general, the potential of being sued deters economic growth. The fear against lawsuits forces individuals and businesses to make decisions based on fear rather than on reason and common sense. Our society has become fear-driven, where everything has to be excessively safe. As a result, our children are growing up fatter and lazier and less adventurous every year. Some schools have banned the game of tag and running for fear of injury. Diving boards have all but disappeared in public pools for the same reason. The solution is to come up with some legal limit on awards given. The law should allow for compensation against injury, but should not be so excessive that fear creeps in. Many states have already adopted such laws. Texas, for example, imposed malpractice caps in 2003. The result? A 50% reduction in lawsuits and an influx of new young doctors. Medical insurance premiums were also reduced for the consumer. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party has tried to block such reforms. The Old Testament gives some guidance against false accusation that is worth hearing in this regard. Quote, "If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and the rest shall hear and fear, and shall never again commit any such evil among you." Unquote. That's Deuteronomy 19:16 through 20. Lawsuits that demand exorbitant sums essentially make accusation of something that didn't happen, something that demands such a large sum to compensate for an act that has never committed. 70 to 80% of Americans currently believe the country suffers from excess litigation and would support some kind of reform in tort law. Moving on to education, the National Education Association, or NEA, is the largest labor union in the United States with 3.2 million members. Its leadership and activities are decidedly left of the political spectrum. It has never endorsed a Republican candidate for president, and in 2009 endorsed same-sex marriage, Much of its campaign contributions go to Democratic candidates. The NEA consistently opposes any proposals that would give great choice to parents in sending their children to public or private schools. In the U.S., public school funding comes largely from local taxes. Their reasons for opposition is that their funding would decrease proportionately. Children tend to perform better in private and specialty schools because the student-teacher ratio is less, and these schools are less encumbered by bureaucratic rules. Again and again, when parents are given the opportunity to receive vouchers to send their children to alternative private schools, they eagerly do so. This union-driven situation is another example of a few people benefiting, the teachers and their unions, while the bulk of the people, parents and children, suffer. The disadvantage results in an increased cost of education and lower quality of education for our children. Another area of special interest that disadvantage many involves Native American population and reservation laws. The current Native American population in the U.S. is about 4.3 million, or 1.5% of the U.S. population. This number includes both pure and mixed blood heritage. Many of these people live in their respective reservations. There are about 310 Indian reservations comprising 55.7 million acres, or 2.3% of the total U.S. land mass. Native American tribes have a degree of national sovereignty and thus have their own laws and legal systems. While the history of these reservations is long and complex, any impartial evaluation of the results of the system today must honestly admit that it is broken. Failed system that traps Native Americans in perpetual poverty and alienation from the rest of American society. While a few Native American leaders derive vast wealth from gambling casinos, 32% of Native Americans live below the poverty line. Unemployment rates are 2.5 times higher than the national average. Alcoholism and drug abuse are also higher than average. Education is tragically low. Only 54% graduate from high school. What is the solution? I think the most necessary change is to allow private ownership of reservation land. Currently, the tribe owns the land. Overall management is by the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, so no one individual has responsibility for the land. Consequently, there is no incentive for individuals to improve the land or develop economic benefit from it. The study of economic development in world history shows that the key to economic growth among any people in any part of the world is enabling individuals to be able to obtain clearly documented ownership of their own property. When individuals can own a piece of land, they care for it, improve it, and develop it. Along with this right should be the right to sell their land to anyone to whom they want to, whether Native American or not. This would allow them to integrate into the economic wealth of the rest of the American economy. Would this then mean that the end of the Indian reservations as we know it exists in the United States? Over time, yeah, it probably would. There is, of course, much objection to this idea among Native Americans. They would prefer to stay separated from the white man. The Bible teaches a system of private ownership of property, not tribal or governmental ownership. Native American culture values the traditions of their elders who did not espouse such notions. Jesus said our traditions make the Word of God ineffective. That's Matthew 15:3. God transcends the traditions of men. Another reform needed is that the tribal court systems on reservations. This must be placed under the jurisdiction of the state in which the reservation exists and should include the ability to appeal to state appellate courts in legal cases. This already happens on some reservations. The current tribal system discourages business from coming in because they have no legal leg to stand on. Of course, this measure would remove some measure of tribal authority, something many Native Americans would loathe to happen. Gambling is another special interest activity that benefits a few and is a disadvantage to many. The total gross income from gambling in the U.S. in 2007 was over $93 billion. This is approximately 0.66% of the U.S. gross national product. Supporters of gambling argue that it brings benefits to society. It allows people to be free to enjoy the entertainment value that comes from spending money at casinos. It provides jobs and tax revenue to states where gambling is allowed, which is often used for improvement of educational systems. However, there are also serious objections. A number of studies have shown that gambling brings negative effects to a society. First, it is harmful because the largest number of gamblers come from the poorest segments of society, who make unwise decisions and trap themselves deeper and deeper into debt. A certain percentage of this population become addicted to gambling. Money losses destroy marriages, families, and any hope of career advancement. Studies have also shown that where gambling businesses are established, crime rates increase. Finally, even though it provides a tax revenue for the state, the people who pay, the poor, are in the least position to pay it. What does the Bible say about it? Not much specifically, but I believe churches should speak against it because the probability of winning is extremely small, and to those that win, it reinforces the idea of making money without working. The pulpit should teach and empower people to work hard and save their money. Christians, therefore, given the opportunity, should vote against any proposal allowing a lottery or casino to operate in their state or city. The social damage is much greater than any real benefit. So what are we to think about our two parties, Republican and Democrat? How do they stand in the issues discussed in this teaching? In the last decade or so, the two parties have grown even more distant from one another, espousing views that have polarized voters. As the prophets have been saying for years, in the end times, white will become whiter and black will become blacker. I think this idea has impacted the political realm as well as society as a whole. As a whole, I think the Republican Party values reflect more nearly biblical values than do the Democratic Party. How can one decide which party to choose? By reading the Bible, by reading the arguments proposed by both sides, and then deciding which side of the aisle is more consistent with biblical values than the other. Sometimes people say they vote for the candidate, not for the party. I think this view is naive. It simply fails to recognize how decisions are actually made in our current political system. Because only parties, not individuals, can get bills passed in Congress and confirm or reject judicial appointments. Every vote for every candidate is a vote for the candidate's party as much as it is for the candidate himself or herself. The Republican Party has been dominated by people favoring smaller government, lower taxes, strong defense, traditional moral values regarding abortion and marriage, the promotion of democracy, and the promotion of free market economies. These stances seem to me to be consistent with biblical teaching on government and a biblical worldview. By contrast, Democratic Party has come to be dominated by people favoring larger government, higher taxes, more reliance on negotiation rather than superior military force in dealing with enemies, opposition to biblical moral standards on abortion and homosexual marriage, and promotion of a more socialistic-leaning economy that is highly controlled by the government. These policies seem to be in the odds of a biblical worldview and a biblical teaching regarding government. As was discussed earlier, the Supreme Court has excessive, unbalanced power in our government today. The American system of government, because of this unrestrained branch of government, is broken. It no longer functions as the Constitution describes that it should. Democrats favor appointing Supreme Court justices who will continue in this direction of making laws and policies rather than just interpreting and applying them. The only way to change this situation is to consistently elect Republican candidates for state and national offices. Democrats favor a woman's right to choose abortion, which means they do not favor any enactment of laws that would restrict a woman's right to take the life of her own preborn child. By contrast, Republicans in general favor laws that protect the life of preborn children. No significant change to laws regarding abortion can ever happen until the Supreme Court overrules its 1973 decision of Roe v. Wade. This will only happen when there is sufficient number of original intent justices to overturn the decision, or an amendment to the Constitution is brought before the people at large. These justices will only be appointed by Republican presidents and confirmed by a sufficient number of Republican senators in the U.S. Senate. Democrats have generally favored higher taxes, in part because this is one way they can redistribute income from the rich to the poor. Biblical teaching actually is not egalitarian in its viewpoint, saying that God gives to those who have and takes away from those who have not. That's Mark 4:25, i.e. the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The good news is that everyone can be rich under God's government system. Republicans, by contrast, have tended to favor more protection of private rights and more emphasis on allowing the free market and free competition between business to solve the problems of allocating goods and services to the economy. I have argued that business in general are the primary means by which wealth is created and increased in the economy, and therefore business should be viewed as a basically good entity. Regarding immigration reform, Democrats have tended to block efforts to carry out a quick completion of a totally secure fence along the Mexican border. This seems largely to be because of the thought that the larger the immigrant population that comes in the United States, the more political power Democrats and other candidates will have. This is putting concerns for their own political power ahead of the good of the people. So why are the two parties so diametrically opposed to one another? I believe the answers are several. One stems from the worldview of human nature. Most Democrats believe man is basically good, while many Republicans take the biblical view that we are not and that we need a Savior, Jesus Christ. The basically good type of thinking has many unsavory ramifications. One of them is that there is no absolute right and wrong. The Bible makes repeated statements of absolute right and wrong because there is a God who transcends human existence. Those who think otherwise and tend to view those who espouse a right and wrong attitude as fanatic fundamentalists. The view that there is no absolute right and wrong allows one to avoid any responsibility to any moral standard, and anything goes as long as they can persuade enough people to think like that. The only way to change things with this no absolutist mindset is with power. The person or government system with the most power is the vehicle of change in this society. This is why Democrats favor a stronger and stronger central government and a weaker state government. So in conclusion to this series on government and Christianity, God calls us to work for good laws and good government in the nations of the earth, because civil government is one of the primary means God uses to restrain evil on the earth. Churches should regularly teach about biblical standards of thinking and behavior so that Christians who are elected to government offices or local school boards will know and understand what God expects government to do and for what reasons and for what goals. In this way, government will more and more become God's servant for your good, as God intended. So this ends this session. Thanks for watching. Next time I'll talk about Christianity and other religions and see how they compare. So remember, the whole earth is full of His glory. God bless you. Bye-bye.
It's beginning to rain. It's beginning.